welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor, please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes, indeed. Time for another rock and read. Today we will pick up where we left off with Chapter 8 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. Let's see what happens next. Rush was released by Moon Records on March 1st, 1974, and by Mercury for international distribution the first week of August. Mercury's was the same version as the Canadian one, apart from our logo on the cover being strangely or just sloppily changed from a kind of Fiesta red to a pinkish hue. But hey, we could live with that. In May, we played a festival in East Lansing, Michigan, featuring the New York Dolls and several bands on SRO's roster, including the Beatles cover band, Liverpool. What I'll always savor about that gig is not the excitement of America per se, or even playing for Americans. I'd been to America before, and grew up watching it on TV. This was the first time I had crossed the border to work there as a working musician. In June, a gig was arranged to meet the buzz in Cleveland that Donna Halper had sparked. Thanks to all the airplay we were getting on WMMS, we were added as special guests to a bill headed up by ZZ Top, with a band from Hungary called Locomotive GT opening the show. Man, we were in awe of the whole experience. Donna showed us around, proud to have almost single-handedly broken us in treating us with a kindness we had never received before. She took us downtown, although Cleveland was a sprawling place without a truly vibrant downtown. Life there happened mainly in the suburbs. But we went to some music stores and walked the streets and drove past the Allen Theater, where we'd be playing that night. When we hit the stage, the crowd's response was infinitely more demonstrative than what we had known in Canada. They just blew us away. They knew our songs, especially, of course, Working Man, and called us back for an encore. But the show was running late, so our night was over. Still, a great experience and a taste of what was to come. Behind the scenes, meanwhile, drama was building. Even after our success on Cleveland radio, John still seemed at odds. Our little taste of stateside touring life had excited Alex and me, but not him. His commitment felt increasingly half-hearted. We knew that something had to change sooner than later. By that time, we had done some gigs with our SRO label mates Max Webster, who had a terrific drummer named Paul Kersey. Vic spoke with Paul about jumping ship and joining us, but following some thoughtful consideration and a brief flip-flop, he opted to stick with Max. For us, meanwhile, there was no turning back. In a meeting at SRO, John agreed it would be best for all if he left the band, and that was that. His last show with us would be opening for some American up-and-comer called Kiss at Centennial Hall in London, Ontario on July 25th, 1974. It's long been rumored that Rutsey left the band, partly due to his diabetes, but that's not the whole story. Yes, he must have wondered if he could hack a long tour on the road because he had to take insulin every day, but the bigger issue was musical differences. To give just one example, Alex and I had written a piece in 7/8 time that would eventually be part of Anthem, which John had no interest in playing. As I've said before, Alex and I were becoming more and more influenced by prog bands, while John was listening to simple, direct rock and roll. We were into Bill Bruford of King Crimson, while one of his favorite drummers was Simon Kirke of Free and Bad Company. Maybe at some point in his life he feared for his health, but the main thing that had been building for a long time was that he wasn't happy playing what we wanted to play. He had become increasingly distant during this period, hanging out more and more with his own set of friends, many of whom were strangers to Alex and me. And I never had a conversation with him about his departure. We barely stayed in touch. The only time he and the band would be together in the same room again was in 1976, when he and Neil were seated at the same table at my wedding. That would of course be a pretty big year for Rush, and I can only guess what was going through his head at the time. I don't know what regrets, if any, he ever had. Just at the moment of John's departure, we were booked at a big gig in the States to support Uriah Heep at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. But wait! Like that great line from one of Rush's all-time top bus movies, High Anxiety, "Hey Norton, missing something?" John left the band in July, and here we were talking about starting an American tour on August 14th. We needed a drummer. We had work to do. We canceled all our pending Canadian gigs. Drummers were contacted to audition, and we packed into a rehearsal hall in Pickering, just east of Toronto. I believe the historic date was July 28th. Neither Alex nor I had ever been to an audition before, let alone held one of our own, so it was awkward as... I remember nothing of the first candidate, I'm afraid, but I know the next guy was Jerry Fielding, a good steady player we knew and liked, and the two others were scheduled. After Jerry left, a Ford Pinto pulled up to the loading dock, and out popped this lanky, goofy-looking guy with short hair and no shirt, and his drums in garbage bags. A Rogers drum kit, I believe, with twin 18-inch bass drums, the smallest kick drums I'd ever seen. When he sat on the throne behind him, he looked like a giant. I remember him carefully checking their positioning, then the rest of the kit, then starting to play triplets, which with those teensy bass drums sounded like machine gun fire. Those were eye-popping triplets. A grin spread from one of my ears to the other. And as we ran through some songs, that grin never left my face. Man, he was so good and so powerful. I suggested we jam on the same piece I've mentioned that John wasn't into, and he nailed it. I mean, nailed it. I didn't need to hear anyone else. His name, of course, was Neil Elwood Peart. There was no way I was letting him escape. After his audition, we lay down on the floor and gabbed away about a variety of things. The Lord of the Rings, Monty Python, stage wear, and more excited to find we had so much in common with him, and even more that he could play double bass drum triplets in 7/4 time. Alex was quiet, however, upset with me, because we had agreed beforehand not to select anyone before hearing each and every candidate, and there I was acting like Neil had already got the job. Later, I had to apologize and agree to hear the others. It was all such a role reversal for us. Alex is usually the one who wears his heart on his sleeve, while I'm generally the methodical decision maker. But I couldn't contain myself. Here was the drummer of our dreams. Just before he left, I overheard Neil talking with one of our crew over a smoke by the mixing console in the hallway. He asked Neil why he'd want to join our band, to which Neil replied, "I really like the raw materials." For me, that comment revealed not so much respect for our musicianship as for his own ambitions. I could have taken offense, but I actually liked that he was thinking big, not just about taking a gig, but being a part of something that could be molded out of raw material. So anyway, the next drummer arrives and quietly sets up his drums. He had made out drum charts to all the songs on our album. He played along correctly, and I'm sorry to say, tamely. Following Neil, the poor guy didn't stand a chance, and even Alex was winking at me. He too knew we already had our man. We called Neil that night, and he came in the next day to officially join the band. I turned 21 that day. What a birthday present. 3 trios that generally affected the overall sound of early Rush: Cream, Led Zeppelin, and The Who. Our first single, Working Man, with its long jam, had been inspired in particular by Spoonful, a song we covered from the start. The 12-bar blues configuration, with the all-too-familiar walking bass line, was in effect my first busy bass pattern, but I pushed beyond it over time because I was always worried about us sounding empty. And once Neil joined the band, I had a partner in crime, another guy who liked to be busy. He liked to follow me just as much as I liked to follow him, both of us thinking, who follows who now? It was immediately clear to me that our interplay was going to be a blast. The hyperactive rhythm section was born. We went into rehearsal straight away, and also reveled in what was like walking through door number 1 on The Price is Right. Mercury Records had signed us to a 5-year deal, with Rush expected to deliver 2 albums a year over that term. And with that contract came our first ever advance, so we raced down to Long and McCade to stock up on gear for our tour. I had been eyeing a Jetglow Rickenbacker 4001, the closest I could get to the one played by my hero of the moment, Yes's Chris Squire. Famously, his was a white 1964 4001S, but you knew that already, because you read my other book, right? Alex bought a 1974 Tobacco Sunburst Les Paul Deluxe, while Neil got himself a stunning silver Slingerland kit with some big-ass 22-inch bass drums. Not bad after being in a band for a week. It was a dream come true for all of us. But let's pause for a quick reality check. That's right, I said 2 albums a year. And that advance I mentioned, short for Advance on Royalties, was only a loan against future earnings. So, yeah, it felt like we were spending their money, when in fact, it was our own. Imagine what those first few weeks must have been like for Neil. Several years earlier, he'd left the comforts of home and, high on expectation, moved to the UK in search of success. He had hooked up with some excellent players, but over a period of 18 months, suffered a string of disappointments and ended up managing a souvenir shop on Carnaby Street. Faced with the choice, as he wrote in his book Traveling Music, between playing good music and starving, or making a poor living playing bad music. He then returned to St. Catherine's, resigned to playing weekend bar gigs, his days spent selling farm equipment parts at Dalziel Equipment beside his dad, Glenn Peart, the owner of the store. Suddenly, a white Corvette pulls up with life-changing intent. A couple of guys get out, one of them a burly, bearded guy with a record in his hand, who introduces himself as Vic Wilson, co-manager of Rush. He tells Neil he's heard terrific things about him, that the band has a worldwide record deal on the table with a tour of the USA ready to go, but no drummer. Neil was understandably doubtful. He says he has to take it all in before agreeing to audition. Thankfully for us, and the world of air drummers, he put his hesitations aside and agrees to come out to play. A matter of only weeks later, having taken his pick of any drum kit he wants, he's fully armed and dangerous, warming up for Uriah Heep and Manfred Mann's Earth Band at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh, USA. Talk about a whirlwind. Earlier in the summer of '74, with Mercury coming in, all of a sudden, Vic and Ray had put a lot of pressure on us to sign a publishing deal with their core publishing company. John was sick at home, so Alex and I attended a big meeting without him at Vic's house. Their lawyer was a skilled negotiator, while ours... Hey, wait a minute. We didn't have one. We were literally on our own. It was very typical for bands to give up their publishing rights in those days, but I was instinctively skeptical and kept insisting to Alex that we not sign everything away. With them dangling the promise of a record deal and a big U.S. tour in front of us, however, he was all too ready to give up the ghost, and after he gave in, I was left on my own to stop the onslaught. It was a terrible position to be put in, and one that I've needled Alex about many, many times over the years. When I did so again just recently, he summed up the tension of the moment perfectly. I mainly remember they were feeding their St. Bernard all of this beefsteak. We were sitting in the living room, and Vic's wife was making up this big dog bowl of piled up meat, and I was thinking how I would love to eat such a beautiful steak if I could only afford it. How easy it was for them to just take advantage of us. My guts churned over the decision. Error, error was flashing in my brain, but I didn't yet have the confidence, legal advice, or leverage to push back, so I too caved in and signed. And afterward, even their lawyer said, "I can't believe how you guys trust these people so much." Don't! Ray and Vic might argue that you can't blame them for what they demanded. Back then, the Canadian music industry made for slim pickings. There were only 4 significant sources of revenue: record sales, radio play, ticket sales, and publishing. Other Canadian artists like Neil Young, Anne Murray, and Gordon Lightfoot filled medium to large venues, as did BTO, April Wine, and the Guess Who. But there were few big arena touring rock bands, no Zepps or Creams, or even Van der Graaf Generators. However, much we aspired to it, we did not yet fill that bill. Rush fell into a musical black hole. Our songs weren't radio-friendly either, and while our managers made a commission from our gigs, earnings from bar and high schools, and the occasional soft-seater were never going to line anyone's pockets with gold, so they had to chase other streams. One potentially significant source of moolah that remained was publishing. So much so that if you were a singer-songwriter who wrote catchy tunes that other artists might want to record, you could do well by signing with one of the bigger music publishing houses before even approaching a record label yourself. Publishing rights raked in money generated by airplay, and if the song connected with the public, record sales. The publishing pie was sliced down the middle, half to the artist and half to the publisher. Now, pop versions of Rush music would not be appearing anytime soon on radio stations, or in elevators or dentist office, but our songs might conceivably be a valuable investment for the future. If one day we did achieve some measure of success, whoever owned the rights would be rewarded for having had the foresight to sign such a rookie band. If not, well, no great loss. It'd be written off as a tranche of their own kind of hedge fund. In that spirit, Ray and Vic had founded Core Publishing, and were now seeking the publisher's share of our music. The artist's share was paid directly to whoever wrote the song, so that was not up for discussion. This was long before artists like us woke up to the realization that we could just as easily start our own publishing houses. Those types of naive errors, or moments of exploitation, depending on your perspective, were the norm rather than the exception, though. Quite simply, we saw giving up our rights as the price of passage into the larger world of rock and roll that we were desperate to enter, into which very few other Canadian bands of our ilk had access. I was learning, though. We'd eventually retain a corporate tax lawyer rather than a typical music business one. A good guy, a good thinker. And when we entered into a long and protracted renegotiation with SRO, we got pretty tough. That wouldn't happen immediately, of course. It was only after the success of 2112 that we knew we held the big stick. By then, I was also getting advice from other management people who were friends as to what was fair. I was doing my homework. I had become wise to the way Ray deployed the classic divide and conquer, calling each band member up, smoozing each of us in turn, telling us what we wanted to hear, and I persuaded the guys that from then on, I would quarterback the renegotiations. I said, Ray's going to call you, but don't say a word. This time around, I was ready to push to the nth degree, and although it took a little time, we ended up improving our deal dramatically. Through our stateside booking agency, ATI, we now acquired our first tour manager, an affable and hilarious character by the name of Howard Unger Waiter. He was originally given the job to report back everything that was going on with us to his superior there, but he soon became an incredibly loyal asset to us. He was a master at intentionally mangling words to comic effect. Out of his mouth, for example, Winnipeg became whippin' egg, or he'd add the sound hern to random proper nouns. Hence, New Haven became New Havehern, Lock Haven became Lock Havehern, etc. Thus, he came to be known as Hearns, and his manglings, Hernstitudes. He was also an unparalleled storyteller who loved an audience, and never let the facts stand in the way of a ripping yarn. He'd worked with Savoy Brown and Brian Auger, and picked up a hell of a lot about lighting along the way. At the start, like any tour manager, Hearns was responsible for booking hotels, doing the advance work, i.e. calling the promoter to review our rider and gig details, booking rental cars, and the settlement after every show, and so on. A fairly straightforward routine. For an opening act, you might say. Just don't leave our fee on the hood of the car, which was exactly what he did after one of our very first shows in the USA. Thankfully, we noticed it there before driving away. Before Howard joined, we had a two-man crew. Ian Grandy, who had been with us since day one, and before we could even afford to pay him, was our loyal everyman. Then in late 71, Liam Burt came on, 17 and a year under the drinking age, so we had to sneak him into our bar gigs. He was our stout defender and friend, and like Hearns, in our employ until the very last gig in 2015. If I ever tour again, I expect both Howard and Liam to be right there on the road with me. In those early days, we knew none of the rules. We were a small-time regional band attempting to step onto a big international stage and making up as we went along. We didn't even know what per diems were. We had zero luxuries in the dressing room and traveled by rental cars for years until we started earning a bit more money as headliners. That, incidentally, is when a tour manager's job becomes a fine art, checking which expenses claimed by promoters are legit and which are not. In 1974, that was Howard's main responsibility, but many years later, when he followed his true calling to become our full-time lighting director, the job fell to Liam, who, let me tell you, was one feisty Scotsman. Rising to the occasion as tour manager, Liam got to the bottom of every receipt. I mean, he even demanded them of us. He wouldn't let 15 cents go unaccounted for, and would nail any promoter or employee to the floor until they coughed it up. That was a beautiful thing to watch in action. For the big stateside gig on August 14, 1974, With Uriah Heep and Manfred Mann's Earth Band, Ian and Liam drove our gear across the border in a leased truck while we flew into town with Howard. It wasn't long before we got our first lesson in American Aggressiveness 101. As we pulled out of the airport, another car cut us off, and our taxi driver yelled out the window, "You sucker! I ought to slit your throat!" Whoa! It was like, "Easy, guy. You got some nice Canadian boys on board, eh?" We were in complete awe of everything. It was the first time we had flown into the USA, which felt more professional than any other arrival to a gig we had ever experienced, and it was new and exciting to be working in a town we had only heard of from movies and television shows and documentaries. All those multi-syllables uttered on newscasts. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The venue was a massive, round structure, the largest we'd ever played, and before the show, I went walking around the entire periphery to see everything. It didn't feel real to me. It was magic, like a walking dream. I wasn't sure I even belonged there. What's more, an empty venue has its own special vibe. It's always exciting to arrive for sound check as the event is still being assembled. After 40 years, of course, you're somewhat inured to it, but we were as green as could be. We didn't even have road cases yet. We were still carrying cables and plastic milk crates, just embarrassingly bush league. Then I ran into Uriah Heeps, Ken Hensley, and Gary Thane as they were climbing out of their limo, looking very much the rock stars du jour. In all their experience and glory, a rock and roll success story in the flesh. That's where I wanted to be. For them, it was the wrap of their successful Wonder World tour, while for us, it was only the beginning. Needless to say, we were eyes wide open, eager to learn and drinking everything in. They were all super friendly, but today, when I look at this picture of me posing with them, I wonder if they weren't secretly going, "Crikey, what a greenhorn." The day raced by, and before I knew it, we were on in 10. This being Neil's first gig with us, after only 2 weeks of rehearsal, we were very nervous. Hearns had advised us to request a modest dressing room rider with a deli tray, Heineken beer, and Blue Nun wine. But I asked for a bottle of Southern Comfort because I had read that rock stars drank that stuff, and when time was called, I took a big swig of it. It went straight to my head, and when we hit the stage, I was so tipsy, I thought I'd fall right off. Whatever condition you're in, it's a huge adjustment from being in a club with people right in front of you to realizing you're just a little speck trying to reach an audience in the bleachers. Now, there's an enormous gap between you and them. You're much higher up. There's a photographer's pit and a barricade, and beyond that, it's just faces that blend away into a kind of surreal oneness. Paradoxically, though, the stage becomes a kind of sanctuary, where you can get down to work with your buddies without too much awareness of whether you're projecting into the mass or not. And with no time to take it all in, we gave it everything we had. People were only just arriving and looking for their seats as Alex's opening chords to Finding My Way smacked around the mostly empty, cavernous concrete building. We blazed through our 26-minute set to a polite smattering of applause, and that was it. Over before it started. That was tough. When you're an opening act, you play that short half hour for people who mostly haven't heard of you and are judging the out of you. There's no instant love. You work really hard, playing as fast as you can, concentrating like mad on making an impression. The first song goes by, then you're into the second one, and just as your fingers are warming up and you're starting to sweat and get a groove on, it's thank you, good night. Over time, of course, you get used to it and learn to savor those precious 26 minutes as best you can. But when we left the stage in Pittsburgh, it was like, what just happened? Still, with our first gig under our belts, we ran triumphantly back to the dressing room to drink the rest of our free booze, then ventured back out to watch the other bands play. Halfway through Heap's set, the retractable roof of the arena opened, and that soulless concrete cathedral filled with soft, warm summer night air. It was pure magic. The record company told us that we needed a proper promo shot pronto, and arranged for us to meet up on a day off in New York with the preeminent photographer, David Garr. He was an unenviable assignment. Far from us, unknown Canucks, having any sort of image, Neil didn't even own stage clothes. For the occasion, he borrowed a blue velvet jacket of mine with embroidered flowers on it, while Alex, to whom David referred constantly as Eric, wore a frilly shirt and jeans, and I, ahead of John Travolta by 3 years, I'll remind you, wore a white suit. He marched us into Central Park and parked us in front of a few of his favorite spots, where we stiffly stood. He tried everything in the book to loosen us up, including, "Okay, smile, you suckers," which got us laughing just long enough to capture something acceptable in front of one of the park's many archways. I used to tease my hair. In pictures of me from the early 70s, you can see how thick it was, but the ones on this tour sometimes reveal how thin it was actually getting on top, and how I had to comb it over to cover up a widening bare spot. After just a few weeks on the road, I contracted an ailment called alopecia areata, and I seriously feared that I might lose all my hair. The treatments were regular shots of cortisone injected directly into the bald areas. Yowie, mama! I was also given a topical steroidal ointment, which Alex would apply for me. Now that's a pal. Yeah, man, I was all jacked up on roids, which, explains my manly physique. Things came at us fast and furious for the remainder of 1974, as we zigzagged anywhere either management or agent could snag us an opening spot, usually as a last-minute add-on to a tour already in progress. We even appeared on a corny daytime TV show for teens called Barry Richards' Rock and Soul. Just imagine, the fast-talking MC introduces a series of pop groups, the kids dance, out of nowhere there's this heavy metal trio, and then they move on to Martha and the Vandellas. Just weird. On camera, Barry Richards asked me, "Hey, what's it been like playing with Uriah Heep?" I said, "It's been great." And that was it. We zipped back to Pittsburgh to open for Blue Oyster Cult at the Stanley Theater, only to find the venue's AC on the fritz, the lineup delayed and disrupted, and our set cut down to 2 songs. Basically, "Hello, Pittsburgh," followed by "Thank you, good night." In fall, we headed south to open for Rare Earth, T-Rex, Kiss, and ill-advisedly, Sha Na Na. Yes, that's right. Our agent idiotically added us to a show of theirs in Baltimore, where their fun-loving, brilliantine quiffed, rock-and-rolling, Fonzie look-alike bands so little appreciated having to sit through our brand of hard rock that they roundly booed us off the stage. In St. Louis a few days later, we opened for the Climax Blues Band and the Italian prog rockers PFM at the Ambassador Theater, and were slated to do our first ever important radio interview at the powerful radio station KSHE. But our after-show party got out of hand when someone distributed some mescaline, or was it STP, keeping us up all night laughing at ridiculous things. I was still tripping the next morning when Hearns called up to say that everyone else had crashed, but he and I had to leave for the station in 20 minutes. Thank God he was with me. My response to almost every question I was asked was prefaced by a thoughtful response before blurting out a suitable answer that Hearns had whispered in my ear. When we got back to the hotel, the guys assured me I had done just fine. Thanks, liars. Rockstar lesson number 1. Do not drop psychedelics before an interview. We were set to headline at the Agora Ballroom in Cleveland the following night. We smoked en route as per usual, and Alex and I jammed on acoustic guitars in the back seat, coming up with what would eventually be Making Memories. An apt title, considering what happened next. We were strumming away when one of us noticed a sign that read, Memphis, 120 miles. I said, Hearns, is Memphis on the way to Cleveland? In a panic, he pulled into a truck stop, and sure enough, we had been heading south, and were now 10 hours by car from where we were supposed to be. Howard plugged a small fortune into a phone booth. Remember, no cell phones or Google Maps in those days, and booked us a flight to Cleveland from Evansville, Indiana, about 140 miles away. As we hightailed it down a network of ever smaller highways and roads, it started to rain. And passing through some town just in the middle of a flash flood, we found ourselves driving in deep, deep water. We slowed to a crawl, pulling at last into the Evansville airport, just in time to watch our flight take off. Undeterred, Neil jumped behind the wheel and drove us through the night, arriving so late at the Travel Lodge in Cleveland that they canceled our reservations. They deployed some cots for us in a conference room, and I will never forget how hard Neil crashed, flat on his back, asleep within seconds. To say that nothing could have woken him is an understatement. After Cleveland, we had an afternoon set at the Minnesota State Fair, then raced back east the next day to Ashbury Park, New Jersey, then played 2 quick shows over the border in Canada. We were still making next to nothing, living off a weekly stipend of $100 or so from a combination of our meager earnings and tour support. Driving being our only cost-effective means of travel, we learned how to sleep on our luggage in the back of our rental station wagon, piling in like college students in a phone booth, chowing down along the way at some IHOP or Howard Johnson's. Good to be young and resilient, but even better if you have something to tide you over on the interstate. We'd sleep on the bags or smush ourselves into a corner, and when we'd wake up, we'd have crease marks crisscrossing our faces. The times we crashed in our clothes at a Holiday Inn, we were grateful just to have a bed. In Evansville, incidentally, we opened for Kiss with Billy Preston as the special guest. The night before, we had stayed at the same hotel, and were up to our usual shenanigans, when Preston, hearing the music from down the hall, knocked on our door and asked if he could join in. We thought, wow, cool, the legendary 5th Beatle wants to hang with us. We had a riot drinking and jamming with him, and ended the night with a rousing rendition of O Canada. The next day, when Billy arrived backstage surrounded by his entourage, we waved and called out his name, and he blanked us completely. We looked at one another, puzzled. He didn't have a problem drinking all our booze. Rockstar lesson number 2. Famous people can be. Well, that's the end of Chapter 8. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 8 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.